Yes. Good morning. It is so wonderful to see a full auditorium today on this Saturday, a little bit of a soupy Saturday. I'm so glad you all came out to hear this opening lecture for the newest exhibition at the Clark. And you know also, I think, that this is a very big weekend for those of you who are staying through to tomorrow or live here. We hope you will see you also at Community Day, which is the splashiest event of the Clark season, I would say. It is a wonderful extravaganza of events and activities, performances, food and drink. It happens rain or shine, and so we do, and we throw open the doors, free admission all day for our guests. So we hope that you will see you tomorrow as well. But today, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for the brand new exhibition, Berenice Abbott's Modern Lens. And our exhibition curator is Grace Hanselman, curatorial assistant for Works on Paper at the Clark. Many of you in this audience may already know Grace from events she leads in the Manton Studies Center for Works on Paper. These include our monthly Drawing Closer program, as well as print room pop-ups scheduled in coordination with our select MetLive in HD screenings, First Sunday Free, and much, much more. So first, I'll give you a few words about Grace's background. She holds an MA in art history from Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Her thesis on Pierre Bonnard was nominated for Case Western's Best Graduate Art History paper in 2023. As an undergraduate, she majored in art history and studio art at Dartmouth College, serving as a teaching assistant in both of those departments. She interned at the Hood Museum of Art on campus and also held a fellowship at Dartmouth's Special Collections Library, gaining curatorial experience in both capacities. And her exhibitions for each venue were titled, respectively, The Butt of the Joke, Humor and the Human Body, and Coeducation at Dartmouth, Behind the Scenes. Before joining the Clark team last September, Grace was a summer curatorial fellow at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, working in the Department of Prints and Drawings. Even with all this prior experience, I think it may have startled Grace somewhat when, in her very first week of work here, she was informed she would be organizing an exhibition of Berenice Abbott photographs. So little did she know, when she accepted our offer of employment, that this show was already on the schedule and it would fall to her to curate it in a space of 10 short months. But with great attitude and energy, she set to work, and it has been a joy to see the project develop from a placeholder description to a fully fledged, thoughtfully crafted exhibition. I know you will enjoy it. I know many of you already have begun enjoying it in the galleries and learn from it, as I have also done. And before inviting Grace to the podium, I'd like to extend deep thanks on behalf of the Clark to Denise Littlefield-Sobel for generously supporting this exhibition. Thank you, Denise. Grace.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the opening talk for Berenice Abbott's Modern Lens. First, I want to extend my sincere thanks to my colleagues here at the Clark, whose hard work and expertise made this show possible. And I'd also like to thank Denise Littlefield-Sobel for her generous support of the exhibition, which is located in the Thaw Gallery for Works on Paper and runs today through October 5th. In 2007, the Clark received over 400 Berenice Abbott photographs, all of them gelatin silver prints, from Paul Katz and Arthur Stephen Penn on behalf of the A&M Penn Photography Foundation. Printed under Abbott's supervision in 1982, the majority of these photographs have not yet been on view. Berenice Abbott's Modern Lens displays them at the Clark for the very first time. The photos were initially meant to be turned into a publication, but a different Abbott monograph with slightly different photo selections ended up being produced. So this here is a little gallery layout to just help orient us. It is not easy to get lost in the Thaw Gallery. Uh, so it is loosely divided into quadrants, and so is the exhibition. Half of the show is made up of Abbott's portraits of people, mostly taken in Paris in the 1920s. And these are the first two sections that you see as you enter from the reading room that I've titled The Parisian Crowd and the Queer Spine of Literary Modernism. The second half of the show is primarily Abbott's American architectural and street views, still portraits in a sense, but of a place rather than a person. These photos were largely taken in the 1930s, but some are from later decades as well. Return to New York, The City as Sitter shows her photography of New York City, which is her most well-known body of work, often associated with her very successful book, Changing New York. The last section explores her representations of the broader American Northeast. Given the location of the Clark here in the beautiful Berkshires, I wanted to show some of her work depicting places with a little less hustle and bustle and a little more elbow room than there might be in New York City. And so I hope that the photos in this last section will feel familiar to some of you. And so I will start at the very beginning. Abbott was born Bernice, not Berenice, in 1898 in Springfield, Ohio. She didn't live there long, though, and she largely grew up in Cleveland, describing a fairly sheltered and occasionally rough and tumble childhood. And on the right is her senior photograph from Lincoln High School in Cleveland, which I actually used to drive past all the time when I was studying at Case Western. And so there comes a moment in many people's lives where they have a truly transformative haircut. And Abbott's moment was right after she graduated. As she describes it, quote, "The day after I graduated from Lincoln High School in Cleveland, Ohio, I had the barber cut off the long, thick braid which hung down my back. And with its departure came a great sense of relief. Shortly thereafter, I arrived at Ohio State University in Columbus. A handful of students from New York at once mistook me for a sophisticate, a worldly New Yorker. All this because of my short hair. We became friends, and a new life began for me," end quote. So here she is with her cool new do, though this photo has jumped forward in time by a few years. She kept the short haircut for the rest of her life. And just to note, if you see an image with a little white star next to it, that means it's actually in the exhibition, so you can see it. So while Berenice Abbott was at Ohio State, she studied journalism. And shortly after finishing, her friends told her, Berenice, you must move to New York City to be among like-minded creative people. And so she did. She moved to Greenwich Village in 1918, staying in an itty-bitty little room, if you could even call it a room, in an apartment shared with several other people. And for a while, one of those roommates was actually Juna Barnes, the noted modernist novelist, who is pictured here on the far right. Juna Barnes's lifestyle was almost too bohemian for Abbott's tastes, and Abbott was glad to eventually move into another apartment by herself. And by virtue of Greenwich Village's high concentration of creatives and the lively bar culture there, she also made friends with several key members of the New York Dada movement, such as Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, and Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. It's a pretty varied group of creatives. Although Abbott was not yet taking her own photographs at this point in her career, she did sometimes participate in and model for her friends' artistic endeavors. So here she is in a photo from Man Ray's 1921 publication, New York Dada. You can't see her face beyond the paper doll with her same hairdo, but it is, in fact, her, I promise. Although she actually never did own up to being the model of this particular photograph. But Abbott's own creative impulses at the time were directed towards sculpture, which after journalism she had decided would be her next venture, which she started studying at Columbia University. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, her work in sculpture is very poorly documented, and little, if any, survives. So practically the only image I've been able to find of one of her sculptures is here, in the background of Abbott's later portrait of the French bookseller Adrien Monnier, who will come up again later. So on the mantle, we can see a small ballerina-like figure with no arms or legs, and this is one of Abbott's sculptures from this earliest phase of her career. Only a few short years after moving to Greenwich Village, she was told once again by her friends, "Berenice, Berenice, Berenice, you must move to Paris to be amongst like-minded creative people." And so in 1921, she crossed the Atlantic, hoping to make it as a sculptor in Paris. She brought very little with her, but she did have a letter of introduction from Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, that was the lady with the spoon crown, that she brought to the home of André Gide, the famous writer. And this letter of introduction helped Abbott to establish herself socially, but her career as a sculptor was less lucky. You may have already gathered, since this is a photography exhibition, that her aspirations in sculpture didn't quite go as she had initially planned. She ended up being unable to support herself, and for a moment she was in quite dire financial straits. So desperate and in need of money, she sought out Man Ray, her old contact from New York, who had also relocated to Paris and had established a photo studio there to great success. And in 1923, he was looking for a new darkroom assistant. And he specifically wanted to hire somebody with absolutely zero prior experience so that he could mold their skills in printing and developing photos to his very experimental specifications. So he hired Abbott with her zero experience. And she turned out to be an extremely competent and productive assistant. And she worked really long hours too. She was doing the work of several people for the wage of just one. But instead of increasing Abbott's pay, Man Ray decided to compensate her for her extra labor by permitting her to use his camera during her lunch break. And yeah, so, well, Abbott took the deal. And so, in 1925, 100 years ago, as of this year, we arrive at Abbott's first photograph. She had been developing them for Man Ray for a few years, but had never stepped behind the camera herself until this moment. Here is her portrait of Paul Cross, a friend of Abbott's that we really know rather little about. He's one of those people who's just known for having slightly more famous friends. But for a first photograph, I really think it is so impressive, especially considering the camera equipment that they were working with in the 1920s. She's got him centered and in focus. And there's also a really nice vulnerability to the image, since Cross looks just a little bit nervous or stiff, and I imagine that Abbott might have been feeling the same way on the other side of the camera. And then we can also see just a little bit of Man Ray's studio in the background, which is where Abbott was working at this point. So working out of Man Ray's studio, she gained momentum as a portraitist quite quickly. It helped that she already had a group of well-connected creative friends, like her old roommate, Juna Barnes, who, surprise, had also relocated to Paris. It was very much the thing to do at the time, relocate to Paris. But so the American expat population there was booming. But Abbott started out photographing her friends, and then friends of friends, and then friends of friends of friends. And then eventually word of mouth started to spread, and she started having people actually seek her out to have their portrait taken, such as the Dada and Surrealist artist Max Ernst. And with every additional person that she photographed, her star kind of rose. And the publisher and bookseller Sylvia Beach, who we will learn about more later, said that, quote, "To be done by Berenice Abbott or Man Ray meant you rated as somebody," end quote. Abbott's first solo exhibition was in 1926 in Paris, and her friend, the multi-talented celebrity Jean Cocteau, wrote a promotional poem about her work that described it as, quote, a chess game between light and shadow, end quote, which I feel is very appropriate. And in the poem, he actually described Abbott herself as a, quote, sexless bird catcher, end quote, which at first sounds like a really terrible insult, doesn't it? But Abbott actually liked that characterization. Sexless wasn't as much of an insult to a woman who often leaned into androgyny on purpose. And bird catching was actually a metaphor for her portrait practice. The birds she caught were her sitters, caught on camera, the colorfully plumed and often noisy members of the Parisian avant-garde. It's also at this point that Abbott's friend Jean Cocteau suggested she make her name sound more French by adding the E, which she did for the rest of her life, becoming Berenice. So, enter Peggy Guggenheim. About a year after Abbott began taking portraits, Guggenheim rang Man Ray's studio and said, "I would like to have my portrait done, please." But she didn't want a portrait by Man Ray, who had already photographed her previously, as you can see from this photo from 1924. She wanted a portrait by Abbott, his assistant. And this did not sit well with Man Ray at all. And he threw, shall we say, a tantrum that resulted in Abbott resigning just to remove herself from the tension. And Guggenheim actually felt quite guilty for accidentally having precipitated this whole affair, so she gave Abbott a loan to purchase her own camera and studio space. And she did get her photo session with Abbott. So here she is with one of her children, the very creatively named Pegeen. I really love the drastic difference in Guggenheim's demeanor between this image and this one taken by Man Ray. I feel like this is the duality of motherhood. But so beyond the situation with Guggenheim, there's one other major thing about Abbott that really had Man Ray grinding his teeth, and that was her relationship with the photographer Eugène Atget, today known for his Parisian street photos in a documentary style. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that if Abbott had never met Atget, he never would have taken such a prominent place in the history of photography. We know Atget because of Abbott's efforts to promote his legacy. Atget was quite little known at the time, his only real admirers being a handful of surrealists who had happened upon his work, Man Ray included. Atget actually didn't even advertise his photographs as art, but as references for other artists to make use of. Abbott met Atget, was deeply moved by his photos, and asked to do a portrait of him, which Atget agreed to. This is one of two photos from the session. The other is more well-known, shows Atget hunched and in profile, and Abbott actually preferred the hunched photo to this one, as she felt it spoke to his life hauling the heavy camera equipment through the streets. But I chose this more frontal photo of Atget for the exhibition because I feel like it deserves some attention as well. And I also just happen to love that little point of light right at the center of his forehead. It was probably because a piece of dust or something came in while the photo was developing, and it's not supposed to be there, but I like to think of it as the spark of genius that Abbott and Man Ray saw in Atget. But unfortunately, when Abbott later went to show Atget the photographs, she learned that he had just died, and his photographs were being dispersed. Abbott was afraid of the photographs being lost to time, so with a loan from her own studio assistant, and at the time her lover, Julia Reiner, Abbott purchased Atget's remaining photographic archive, which was quite vast. When Man Ray found out Abbott had acquired the archive, he was furious. Allegedly, he felt that he was the one who had discovered Atget, and so felt he deserved the archive. So in Paris, Abbott had really begun to come into her own as a photographer. She was getting quite well known for her signature sharp, no-nonsense portrait style, which was a deviation from other photographic movements like pictorialism, which prized that more soft focus, dreamy look. I think she also had a particular gift for creating compelling portraits of women that did more than just celebrate traditional femininity. To round out this section, here are a few of my favorite portraits that she took while in Paris. On the left is Sugiharu Fujita, who was a Japanese-born artist working in Paris. And he was known to be quite quirky and a very eccentric dresser. And a tidbit that I absolutely love is that apparently he would go to the opera wearing a lampshade on his head. And he would try to convince Parisians that the lampshade was traditional Japanese headgear. He and Abbott also shared a love of cats, which were a major subject in Fujita's work. And in the middle is Mary Tor, and I love her expression in this photo. She looks so determined and sure and almost a little bit scary, kind of like that Guggenheim photo that Man Ray took. Mary Tor was the sister of the American painter Helen Tor, who was the wife of Arthur Dove. And she's the reason that we have any of Helen Tor's paintings today. Helen had demanded that her sister Mary destroy all of her work after she died, but Mary went against her sister's wishes and instead donated the paintings to the Heckscher Museum of Art. And I think you can tell that she had a very rebellious spirit from this photo. And I also enjoy the parallels between Mary Tor's care for her sister's art and Abbott's care for Atget's archive. They were both very determined to secure the artistic legacies of other people. And on the far right is the American journalist Janet Flanner, who was the Paris correspondent for the New Yorker magazine and was often at the center of the queer and lesbian scene in Paris. She's wearing this very interesting costume that's kind of a hybrid of Uncle Sam and this masquerade ensemble. That's a very charismatic photo. So that more or less covers Abbott's early life and the beginning of her career, as well as the first quadrant of the exhibition. The next section, which I've called the queer spine of literary modernism, is all about demonstrating the impact of queer writers and publishers through Abbott's portraiture. For today, I've chosen to pull out the story of James Joyce's modernist novel, Ulysses, which is considered by many to be the greatest novel of the 20th century. Joyce, pictured center, was surrounded by a constellation of very influential lesbians who ended up being essential in the publication of Ulysses. The novel had its origins as a serialized publication, first printed in the literary magazine The Little Review, starting in 1918. Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap were both romantic and business partners, and initially operated The Little Review out of Chicago. I love the byline, making no compromise with the public taste, as Ulysses was later taken to trial on obscenity charges. But who better, to handle an obscenity charge than a pair of lesbians, who were used to being accused of obscenity just by living their daily lives. So they continued publishing Ulysses and ignored the obscenity trial. The next part of the story happens in Paris with another lesbian couple, Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier. And first, I have to tell the story of how Beach and Monnier met because it is so sweet. But allegedly, Beach, who's an American, was in Paris and her hat blew off, and Monnier went after it and retrieved it for her. And when they greeted each other, Monnier immediately sensed that Beach was American and said, "J'aime beaucoup l'Amérique." So I love America. And then Beach replied, "J'aime beaucoup la France. I love France." And then from that point on, it was history. They were lovers. But so they each operated their own bookstores in Paris, and Sylvia Beach's store was particularly well attended by the English-speaking expat community and became a center of literary life in Paris. The picture in the center is Beach and Monnier speaking with James Joyce in Beach's bookstore, Shakespeare and Company. Joyce had an immensely hard time finding a publisher to print Ulysses in full because of the obscenity trials for the serialized version. and Sylvia Beach offered to publish it for him and did so in 1922, several years before this central photo was taken. But so they continued the relationship with Joyce. And the last piece of the Ulysses puzzle is Abbott herself. She took several portraits of James Joyce in 1926, which have gone on to become the most well-known photos of the author, largely because of their presence on lots of dust jackets. The one at center is particularly famous and paints a very proud picture of who Joyce was. And where I chose the slightly more dignified version of the Atget portrait, for Joyce, I've chosen to exhibit a lesser known but more vulnerable image from the same sitting where he's removed his eye patch. Late in 1927, Abbott visited New York, only intending to stay a short while. But New York had changed a great deal since she left in 1921, and she found that tremendously exciting. Skyscrapers were being built, old buildings were being demolished, new people were constantly coming into the city, and Abbott wanted to capture it all before it was irrevocably changed. It's also likely that her recent work with Atget's photos of Paris excited her about the possibilities of documenting an entire city rather than its individual inhabitants. Abbott was especially interested in the juxtapositions between old and new that were cropping up all over Manhattan. She said, quote, "When I saw New York again and stood in the dirty slush, I felt that here was the thing I had been waiting to do all my life," end quote. She went back to Paris to pack up her life there and then moved back to New York in 1928 with Eugene Atget's archive, which occupied like 17 crates. It was a lot of stuff. But so when she got there, she launched herself into trying to get Atget's photography exhibited and published, but also drastically changed her own artistic output. Instead of doing portraits, which was her bread and butter in Paris, she started focusing on street and architectural photography. And she also started using what would come to be her absolute favorite camera, which was called the Century Universal 8x10 View Camera, which is about a foot cubed to give a sense of how big that object was. It was really no mean feat to be hauling that up and down the streets of New York and up and down stairs. And this photo here on the screen is one of her earliest that she took in New York, and it's about as figural as this body of work gets. And interestingly, the first photo that she ever purchased from Eugene Atget when he was still alive was of a rag picker's hut. And so I find it fitting that one of her first New York photos was of a rag merchant. It's kind of like she brought a little bit of Paris back to New York with her. Here are some more New York photos. On the left is one of Abbott's photos of Penn Station, which is notable not only for the technical skill needed to take the photograph, but also because this historic version of Penn Station was demolished and replaced, to Abbott's horror. That's one of the things that I've found most interesting about exploring Abbott's architectural photography. Many of the buildings have since been demolished or fundamentally transformed, but some of them stand today identical to the way they looked in Abbott's photographs. Her Penn Station photos probably demonstrate this the most poignantly, since the failure to preserve the initial structure caused such an uproar. Because of visual similarities, I've paired Penn Station with the photo on the right, which initially was just untitled with no parenthetical. And so I initially didn't know that this photo was of the Wanamaker department store building. A trick of perspective had me thinking that it was this grand structure with the vaulted glass roof, much like Penn Station. And so I was searching around for buildings that would have had that type of roof in New York City, but I couldn't find a single thing. And it wasn't until I saw this photo on the right that I realized the roof I was seeing on the left was actually just a single-story awning that Abbott was standing under as she photographed the building across the street. But the way that she's perfectly aligned the light bulbs on the awning with the arches across the way creates the illusion of a much grander, continuous indoor space. So Abbott's New York photography phase culminated in the 1939 publication of Changing New York, a federally funded project that sought to capture New York City in its state of flux. She had a collaborator on this project, beyond the government. It was her partner, Elizabeth McCausland, who was an art historian and critic who contributed the textual descriptions that accompanied Abbott's photographs. Abbott and McCausland met in 1935 because of Changing New York, and they remained a couple for the next 30 years until McCausland's death in 1965. So at the upper left, we have this very cozy photo of the street from the window at 50 Commerce Street, which was the apartment that McCausland and Abbott lived in together for several decades. Lower center is a photo of McCausland at her printing press, which she used to print and distribute her own poetry. And then top right is a spread from Changing New York, showing one of Abbott's more iconic images of the Flatiron Building, which also demonstrates that one of the aspects of New York City that interested her most was its ever-increasing verticality. And the star there is slightly misleading. We do have Changing New York in the show, and we do have the Flatiron in the show, but I have actually opened Changing New York to a different spread, so you will have to go in and be surprised. So here, I'm making a very brief foray back into portraits, just to demonstrate that while she mostly had pivoted to architectural photography, she still occasionally revisited portraiture. She took this photo of David Sarnoff and a few other businessmen for Fortune magazine, but she clearly did not enjoy the assignment, as she later said that she had no talent for photographing, quote, stinky little men, end quote. She much preferred creative types. Alelia Walker, though, Abbott actually liked. She was the daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, who made a fortune in cosmetics. Alelia frequently hosted queer-friendly parties and salons at her Harlem residence, some of which were known to get a little wild. And that brings me to the last section of the exhibition, which features Abbott's less well-known photos of cities and towns besides New York City. It took her a while to get federal funding for Changing New York, so she did assignments elsewhere to get by. In 1934, she went on a trip with the architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock to do two projects simultaneously. These two photos were from a project to document the architecture of the architect H.H. Richardson, who has buildings scattered across the eastern US. So we have the Cheney Building in Connecticut on the left, and the Walter Channing House, which is in Massachusetts, on the right. And the project on Richardson culminated in an exhibition of Richardson's work at the Museum of Modern Art, which was accompanied by a publication where Abbott's photos are used as illustrations. And that book is also in the exhibition today. These two photos were from a project exploring the urban environments of the US in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. The project was for an exhibition curated by Henry Russell Hitchcock at Wesleyan University. On the left, we have Albany and Boston on the right. And that little Boston townhome is actually pretty much identical today, and it was even recently listed for sale, and if I remember correctly, I think it'll cost you about $16 million if you want to live there. So historicity doesn't come cheap, but it is pretty much unchanged. And another quick deviation before I come to the last works in the exhibition. I would be remiss to discuss Berenice Abbott without at least mentioning the significant body of work which does not appear in this exhibition, her scientific photographs. In the 1950s, she worked with MIT to illustrate, through photography, the principles of physics. But just appreciate how she's managed to capture absolutely 100% of the information that she needs to illustrate the principle, and absolutely 0% of the information that she doesn't need. They're almost like diagrams. They're so perfect, but they're they're photographs. They're just incredible. But unfortunately, they are out of the scope of this specific show. And this was also one body of work that was not represented in the 2007 gift of Abbott photos. These two photos, which end the exhibition, are of Maine, which is where Abbott moved after Elizabeth McCausland died in 1965. The photo on the left of the weather vanes was taken on a long 1954 road trip down the US Route 1 from Maine down to Florida and back again. Abbott had wanted to turn the project into a publication showing how American towns were being transformed by the increasingly ubiquitous automobile. Unfortunately, the project was never funded, so the photographs have gone relatively underappreciated. The photo on the right of the lighthouse is the latest photo in the exhibition by several years, and I actually see this photo as a bit of a self-portrait of this tall, proud, solitary figure of Abbott traversing Maine and looking at the world through her roving camera lens. And I do wonder if there might be some poetic significance to the location of Cape Elizabeth, given Elizabeth McCausland's passing 2 years before. Abbott's last book project was titled A Portrait of Maine, published in 1968, and focused largely on the logging and lobstering industries. The lighthouse photo wasn't included in that book, probably because Abbott generally preferred to highlight humbler subjects. Landmarks didn't need any help from her. Personally, I find it fitting that this photograph, that I feel speaks so much to Abbott's own life and temperament, remained a little bit more private. She died in her home in Monson, Maine in 1991 at the age of 93. And I thought I'd try and end this lecture on a lighter note. So Hank O'Neill, who is a photographer who knew Abbott personally and worked with her over the last 19 years of her life, took this photo of Berenice Abbott in 1977, so she was 79 years old at the time. Hank will be coming to the Clark to speak on August 3rd, and he also has a forthcoming book about his experiences working with Berenice Abbott, so I really hope that you folks can make it to that event as well. Thank you very much. Alrighty, so I think we are for a little bit. Please be gentle. Oh goodness, I think it's where in Manhattan was the Wanamaker building? Goodness, I don't remember that off the top of my head. Unfortunately, I'm not a New Yorker, so perhaps there could have been somebody more geographically equipped to. Isn't it lovely to have a knowledgeable audience?
Hello. So I had a question. What happened? The photographs all said that they were reprinted in 1982. So what happened in 1982 that all these photographs were reprinted?
They were preparing for a publication that, like a retrospective monograph of Abbott's work, but they ultimately decided to go in a slightly different direction and use different photographs, many of which are quite similar, and there is some overlap between the photographs that they developed in 1982 and the photographs that they ended up using for Berenice Abbott, American Photographer, is the book. But yeah, that was the reason why it was intended for a publication that never came to fruition.
The picture of Sylvia Beach and Adrian and James Joyce, that was not taken by Berenice Abbott, was it?
No, it was not. Okay. That was taken actually by a woman, I believe her name was Giselle Frund, who was kind of a third in the the Beach-Monnier relationship for a short while. She was a refugee that they were helping to conceal from the Germans.
Did Man Ray and Abbott ever reconcile?
Not that I'm aware. I think Man Ray kind of was a little salty about things for pretty much the rest of his life. Yeah, I've never seen anything to allude to a reconciliation.
Where did the Auger collection go, the one that she put together?
So she had it published in numerous publications and exhibitions, so she saw to that once she came to New York. But as far as I believe she donated much of her archive to the Image Center in, I'm forgetting exactly which city that is, but there's a large archive where a great deal of Abbott's photography was donated to, so they have kind of like the catalogue raisonné of her work, essentially. But yeah, that's where the Augers would have gone.
I remember that in the 80s, the Museum of Modern Art published this huge, like 3-volume set of those Atget street photographs. So I believe they have a lot of Atget in MoMA's collection as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. And Abbott didn't get the entirety of Atget's archive. Some of it had already been sold off and dispersed before she showed up and learned that he had passed away and was able to get money to purchase the archive. By that point, much of it had already gone. But yeah, she did hold, I would say, a majority of his at least existing negatives and things like that. Lots of glass plate negatives that she was having to haul around in these big crates. But yeah.
Did she ever reconcile with Man Ray?
No, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. I haven't found anything to allude to that particularly. But yeah, I think Man Ray was upset about the way things went kind of for the rest of his life, although it certainly didn't impact his own success by any means. He was wildly successful in his own right, but I think he also felt entitled to Berenice Abbott's success, maybe because she was initially his assistant, I'm not sure, but it pricked his pride.
I just wanted to mention that I have this book I bought years ago of Atget's photos, and after I read what the talk was going to be about, I looked at it, and the editors, the authors are all different people, but at the very back in small print it says that all of the photos are from her collection.
Oh, so. Wonderful. Yeah, she really was very, very dedicated. She described later in her life that she was carrying Atget on her back all these years. She, at points, I think, even kind of neglected her own career in certain areas in order to funnel her energy into promoting Atget's legacy. So she was very busy, both with his legacy and hers.
Do you have any idea how Bernice got involved with MIT? I know that MIT has a gallery in which their scientific work with Bernice is illustrative of her work there.
From what I'm aware, she kind of decided that this would be her next project, her next great interest after she published Changing New York and had some years in between, but she eventually landed on this conviction herself and then sought out the folks at MIT and kind of convinced them, you need me to help you do this and illustrate this. So that's how that initially came to be. But unfortunately, I don't know too many specifics about the circumstances behind her scientific photography, just as I have been very focused on the things that have been in this exhibition. But her scientific photographs really are so tremendous, but they're also incredibly different from the rest of her oeuvre. So couldn't figure out how to make them fit, unfortunately. Both thematically and literally in terms of wall space. But
Did she have any relationship with Lee Miller, both of them being assistants to Man Ray?
She definitely would have had, like, at least they were acquaintances. I mean, she was working with all of the folks in and around Man Ray's studio, which was numerous people. But I'm sorry, I don't know any specifics about her relationship with Lee Miller. But I definitely imagine they would have crossed paths daily. Oh, so in that case, yeah, so Lee Miller would have come to work for Man Ray after Berenice Abbott had already departed, and so she would have had basically no contact with them, probably. Yes?
Anybody now looking for 20th century photography would conclude that Ache is one of the great distinctive visions, one of the really important photographers. When the Modern published that 4-volume set of pictures, it established a visual resource for people who might not have known much about him. Why, if we now regard him as a towering genius, did it take Berenice Abbott 2 or 3 decades to get his reputation established?
I think maybe part of that was due to the fact that Berenice often neglected her own career in favor of pushing Ache forward. She spent an immense amount of time and energy managing that archive, advocating for his work, and she could have been spending that time on her own work. So that, I think, is definitely a factor. Of course, it's all speculative to some degree. And I mean, there's also the perhaps obvious statement that she's a woman, and more than that, she's a gay woman. So I think maybe she just needed to find her time. But she definitely was, she was not unknown by any means, even though Ache is perhaps a little bit better known than her. Like, she was having large-scale museum retrospectives. She's had multiple monographs published on her before she died, and continues to have monographs published on her after. So it's hard to kind of make a real solid comparison of their levels of fame and influence, but I do think that to some degree she kind of might have shot herself in the foot in terms of spending so much time on Ache and not as much time on herself. Do we have maybe one more question, or are we all set?
Did Abbott leave her own writings to us? Did she write about her life at all?
She did, and she's quite a good writer, as you might guess from her early interest in journalism. She's very articulate. She chooses very expressive words, and some of her writing about photography and what it can mean is really so very beautiful. I have on my desk right now a collection of writings by Berenice Abbott. So there have been published volumes just collecting from all across the different periods of her career. She also published in mid-career, around the 50s, some like instructional volumes on photography, teaching people how to do what she did. So we have technical writing from her as well as this more poetic writing. Yeah, thank you very much.